Great. Hello, hello. Hi, everyone. How are you? Okay. Let me just get this message out of the way. Yep. Everybody able to see my screens okay, right? Maybe give a thumbs up. Awesome. Thank you, Sonia. Cool. So thank you so much for joining the sessions today. My name is Katrina. I'm a senior product designer at Microsoft. I'm currently working as part of the Azure Security Design Studio, focusing on designing cybersecurity products. And outside of my day job, I'm the North America Director for Ladies at UX, which is a global organization where I support chapter leaders in the North America region to build a network of support system for those who are in the UX field. So you're also all really very welcome to check out your local chapters of Ladies at UX. So I want to start by a little bit about myself, my journey, and how I got where I'm at. I started as a web graphic designer in 2007, stepped into art direction in a marketing agency in 2010, pivoted into UX design in 2015, and started as a product designer in the cybersecurity space last year in 2021. Now let's talk about designing under constraints. So you might ask, why should I worry about constraints? Unless you're working on a passion project that is strictly for your own personal enjoyment with no users involved and like the sky is limit. Otherwise, there will always be design constraints. Even if you're the owner, there would be design constraints. Even if you're the design director, there would be design constraints. As long as you're a designer, there are different things that you need to consider. Now, based on my experience, I have identified 6 different types of common design constraints that you need to think about as a designer. Time, requirements, user needs, style guide, technical constraints, resources. So I'm going to dive into each of the 6 different types a little bit. I'm going to provide you with some examples of the under each type, as well as like to think through how to work with that particular constraint. Now so first let's talk about time constraint. That's the most common constraint that you need to think about. So I like this to be, I would love this workshop to be more interactive. So can you think of some like examples or ideas of design constraints? Feel free to put it in the chat, like something that's you experience. Yeah, if you think of some examples, feel free to put it in the chat. I'd love to see interact with you all. Deadline next week. You had no idea context. Yep, that's a good one, Celine. Yeah, anyone else? Feel free to jump in. By the way, I'll try to leave some time for Q&A at the end. However, if you have a burning question that you really want to ask, feel free to drop your question in the chat or raise your hand. So deadlines definitely is one thing that is the project deadline that's on the top of the list. And so as a student, you might have project deadline, you might have finals. So that's definitely a good example of constraint. And in the client budget, yeah, so that's it. Exactly. That's exactly one of the constraints that we're going to talk about. And then like here are some other examples or internal reviews. So as you get a job, as you work as a designer, you will have like different types of deadlines and different types of time timeline that you need to meet. Like there might be internal reviews, there might be, if you're working with clients, you might have client reviews, you might have a testing schedule that you need to think about. You might have to think about the design handoff, when it needs to be hand off to the engineering team. There may be a launch day that you need to consider. You might need to do a presentation. So that's like time constraint is one of the most important ones that you need to think about. Now let's think about how to work with time constraints. again, I'd love for you to drop some ideas in the chat if you have any, or how you personally manage the time constraints that you have. And yeah, we can make this a little bit more conversational. Prioritizing tasks, that's very good. So here are a few tips. Like prioritizing tasks is definitely one of a good one. So I would say, like, first you need to figure out the schedule early on. So like for a school project, that might be easy, right? Because usually there's already a deadline that you already see at the beginning. But sometimes in the working world, when you work as a designer, sometimes they say, oh, I need this, I need that. But then you may not get a really solid deadline because sometimes that could be, so we talked about like product launch dates as one of the time constraints. However, if the product is launching tomorrow, if you have the design done today, that's not going to work, right? Because you're likely that you need to work with some internal teams to get feedback, and then you're likely that you need to hand it off to engineering, and engineering also needs their time to build out the products. So you need to kind of like figure out the schedule early on. So even though if you're working with the PM, so they may tell you, oh, this is going to launch in next month. We have 4 weeks. But what does that mean? It doesn't mean you have all full 4 weeks for design, right? You need to like budget for time for like engineering, and then you need to know like when you need to like have a first draft ready. So yeah, planning in advance, like prioritizing tasks is definitely some good ideas to think about. Like just like think about the roadmap of, okay, so if it is going to be launching in 4 weeks, and then engineer needs 2 weeks to build it. So that means you have like 2 weeks. And so within that 2 weeks, you might need to do some research to understand the scope, and you might need to like talk to users. You might need to talk to your manager. You might not need to talk to your team to brainstorm. So I think like another thing is important is identifying all the tasks that you need to do, and also estimating design time needed for each task. So depending on the job and the company, you might be doing both research and design and wireframing and all that, or maybe your focus is in research, or maybe your focus is in the visual design part. So figure out like what your personal task versus like anything that you could be blocked on. So say if you're relying on a UX researcher to give you some results, so how much time does the UX researcher need? Does this person need like 1 day, 1 week? So if the researcher needs 1 week to do the research, and then you have 1 week to design, and then you need to hand off to the engineering team. So it's not a lot of time, right? So sometimes it's understanding the schedule, understanding when each task needs to be done, and setting milestones is also one of the thing that could be helpful. So you might want to say, okay, if I have only 2 weeks to design and I'm doing all the research myself, so you might want to budget time for, okay, for the first 3 days, this is when I'm going to be doing the research. And then for 2 days, I'm going to start drafting ideas, or whatever your design process is. Setting milestones for yourself is good. And another thing is also understanding hard deadlines versus arbitrary deadlines. Sometimes if you're working on bigger products, you might have like more time to work on a feature. It could be 3 months, 6 months, but again, it doesn't mean that you have the full 3 months and 6 months to do all the design tasks. So understanding hard deadlines versus arbitrary deadlines is also important. So if you're working with the PM, with a product manager, program manager, project manager, usually you would work with someone in that role, regardless of the design job that you have. So they may say, hey, we need a design but in 2 weeks, okay? And so if that is impossible based on the scope of the project, then you might want to ask questions. So another thing that I would say is to ask questions to figure it out. Is this do you need it 2 weeks because engineering is starting on it, or do you need it in 2 weeks? Is it for like the first draft and that we still have opportunity to refine? So understanding the deadline is important. Now, once you understand that, like you might want to like fight with the development team and they're like, oh, we need design in 2 weeks because we need 4 months to develop. And so you know, like that's something that maybe you and your manager need to work with the dev team to make sure that everybody gets reasonable amount of time to do the task they need. Celine is saying, sounds like setting opportunity cost to task components within design pauses, like how much time you should set aside, but also once you go through it, maybe take more time. Yeah, that's true. So this is a good point. Estimating design time needed. So this is something that I myself like had to learn over time. So some at the beginning, I may think, oh, I can do this design in 2 days. But then as I get into it, I realize, okay, 2 days is not enough time. So this is something that you will learn over time, and then you would be able to make better estimates as you gain experience. Now, next, let's talk about requirements. So this is another really important thing to that you need to think about. So some of the examples are specifications of features, accessibility requirements, or legal compliance, depending on the countries, depending on the field, depending on what product you are designing. So again, if you can think about more examples, feel free to put it into the chat and let's talk through it and think through how to manage requirements as a constraint. So I think like another thing, yeah, so bookmark requirement docs is one of the things that I do first. So usually the way it works is that when there's a new feature that we need to work on, oftentimes there's already like some bounding box that like some outline of that feature that has already been drawn. And that could be based on some past user feedback and based on the product manager's visions as well as the capacity of the engineering team. So sometimes there's already some sort of bounding box. And so there's like often this like Word doc or a PPT doc, whatever tool that the PM use. So make sure that you bookmark all the requirement docs the first time you get it. Like in the student scenario, that might be the brief, right, that you get from your professor. You want to make sure you don't lose it, right, so that you know what it is that you need to design. And then definitely you want to check against the specs from time to time. And another thing is understanding where the requirements are coming from is also very important. So earlier I mentioned that a lot of time when I start designing, there's already some preset requirements. Maybe that has to be deal with the business goals, the overall company goals, and like something we're trying to reach, right? So understanding where the requirements are coming from is important because sometimes it could be based off past user experience. And then based on the user experience, maybe the product manager has done a round of like brainstorm with the leadership team and then figure out, okay, this solution A is going to solve problem X, right? But like feel free to question it and feel free to ask questions. I mean, don't be afraid to challenge the status quo. But of course, if you're a junior designer, you want to do it very nicely. You don't want to be going to the product manager. It's like, hey, I don't think this is a good idea. You need to like, so learn about it, like build a good relationship with everyone you work with, like build a relationship with the engineering team, like if there's like some constraints over there, understand it. And then also research and look at references. So this is also a good way to think about, okay, so if the requirements is that you like if there's like a specific feature that is needed, then you might want to like research, like do your competitive analysis, look at what how other product managers solve this problem, and look at references. checking against that. Does this mean like updates or design requirement docs, especially when there's changes due to other external? Yes, actually that's a really good point. So usually at the beginning of the project, there's already kind of like some specs already defined. But again, like this is like what you're referring to is about understanding where the requirement coming from. So like in the perfect world, you make a plan and then everything goes as planned, but we are not in a perfect world. So things often change. And so maybe we have some new findings from the users or maybe the business goal change. So it does shift and pivot from time to time, depending on how big your feature is. And it depends on many different factors. So yeah, it's true that things could change, and that's when you want to make sure you keep a good channel to communicate with PMs and everyone involved to get an understanding on where the requirements are coming from, and also like, is there wiggle room? Like maybe you have a better idea to solve the problem that they're trying to solve. So understanding the problem that you're trying to solve, that's another thing that you need to think about. Okay, so let's see. Okay, next, want to talk about user needs. So they are user wants, this user needs, and this the goals and the product costs. And so the goals, I kind of like touched on that earlier too, like figure out what is the goal of this product? What do we want the user to do in this product? Like, is it a photo taking app? Like the goal would be, the primary goal would be taking photos, right? So what is the goal? And then like think through the user goals and check it against like the specs. Like is the spec not reaching some of the, is it not solving some of the goals? So here are some like user needs examples. Let's see what I have. Yeah, so and then figure out the must-have versus nice to have. So a lot of time designing with constraints is all about making compromises and prioritizing, right? So there might be some that is a must-have. There might be something that is nice to have. In like from the user experience standpoint, of course, we want to build a product that is as smooth as possible, as great as possible, as easy to use as possible, and think about user-centered design. However, sometimes we will be faced with like constraints of like the time constraints or maybe the resource constraints. So all the constraints is kind of like interrelated. And then like with that, maybe you have like this really great idea, but then there's just not enough time for you to design everything out. And so that's when it's important to identify the must-haves versus nice-to-haves. So you can figure out, okay, so this is the priorities, these are the needed required features. And then maybe there are some additional feature that would make it a really great experience. However, may not get published in the first run, right? So maybe in the MVP, you don't get everything, but then as you go on to develop products, then you can like put the nice to haves like with lower priority. Another thing is to get to the bottom of the needs that is identified from your research. So sometimes, sometimes user might say they need something, but then it's important to like dig deep and ask questions and get to the bottom of it. Do they need to take, so going back to like the photo app example, are they taking the photo because they need to post it, or is it just for like what is the reason why they need to take a photo? So getting to the bottom of the needs and thinking thinking about the user goals, and also like thinking about considering the business goals. So what is the goals of the business? Is it to get more users to use this feature, or is it to let me see, what other examples is there? Or do they want, like, they don't need more user, but they need the user to use it more. So, so again, like those are some examples. Also, another thing is important to think about is how user currently solve this problem. So, so identifying the problem, figuring out the user goal, and also learning about how do they currently solve this problem. With the feature that you're trying to build, you need to think about, okay, like how are they doing this right now? Like sometimes there's like workaround, like for examples, like with the Apple Watch as an example, I think it was kind of like it was before it was Apple Watch, it was the I can't remember, like it was like just a music device, right? And so the user was solving problem by like attaching straps to make it like a watch. And so that inspired Apples to make this as a whole line of like product, a new product that is really successful. So I see a question there with checking against X. Does this mean, oh, sorry, a little bit slow, especially when there's changes due to other external constraints and pivot. Yeah, so definitely like those constraints. Oh, it's already answered. Great. Sorry, I'm trying to like look at both. Okay, so next style guide. Awesome. So some examples of style guide. So this most definitely always a brand guidelines, no matter what company you work for, even if you work for agency that picks projects from other clients, the clients might have the brand guidelines. So that's definitely something you need to follow. Design principles. So the general design principles, like thinking about the just like user experience, like how to make a good user experience, like all the principles that you're learning from school. So definitely those are something you need to consider. System design library. So sometimes for a more established company, they might already have a system design library figured out. And then another thing is consistency. So as you design for products, you want to make sure that you're designing a consistent experience. So that it's like the user doesn't have to learn it over and over again as they go through the feature. You want to make sure that there's like unifying and consistent experience throughout. So a couple of tips on working with Style Guide. Definitely get familiar with all the guidelines that exist. So a place like Microsoft, there's like tons of different guidelines and at different levels, like at the overall brand level, and then also the sub product level, and then also in your product feature level. So there's like a lot of different guidelines. So get familiar with them the best that you can, and then also build design components that is already fitting the guidelines would make your life easier. As a new designer joining a company, you may find yourself learning a bunch of different style guides, and it is something that will get easier over time. At first, it could be overwhelming, and building design components that already fits the design, the company guideline, that would be really helpful. If the design system is not already existing, you might want to build it and like build some consistent button styles, and it will also help with consistency. How does build up current components given some room to evolve? Yeah, so if you are at a place where there's already a design system in place, there's no perfect design systems, right? Everything is always evolving. There might be new feature that you need to build. And so sometimes you might find yourself that, oh, I'm looking at like this new control, like a slider control that they don't already exist in the library. So it really depends, like to answer your question, Celine, how does one build up components while giving room to even evolve? So you might want to work with figure out the company settings, right? So for bigger company like Microsoft, there might be a team that has has a team that is specialized in like creating the guidelines, creating the system. So you might want to work with that team and talk to that team and say, hey, I am experienced that I might need a new slider control that is not existing in the current library. Like ask for recommendations, ask for suggestions. Like, do you is there any examples like that I can take from the library? Because it's true that like you want to do your due diligence and do your research. You want to make sure, like if you work for a bigger company, you want to search through the style guide, the design system, to make sure that you didn't miss it. And so you might want to talk to people. However, if you're working at like a mid-sized to smaller company, maybe it's easier, right? Maybe you are the person who manages the design system. So if that's the case, you will still need to like think about how can you design this element to fit the most use cases and make the most impact out of this new button controls that you're creating. One thing to avoid is like to create new components every other days, and then you end up having a really ununified experience, right? So you want to make sure. Okay, thank you, Vivian. Looks like we're at time, but let's see. So whoever can stay, like you're welcome to stay. If you have to go, I think this is being recorded. So build up the current. So yeah, I hope I answered your question, Celine. So you want to do your research and make sure that what you're looking for is not already existing. And then if you figure, okay, this is indeed a new like control, new slider that is not existing, then you want to align it with like the brand style guide, like the colors, the styling. It needs to look like a family. You don't want to, if your brand color is blue, you don't want to just go off and create a green slider bar that is completely different. So you need to think about like the family, think about the design system as a family that even though you're designing something new, it still needs to look like it's part of the family. Okay, what am I at? Okay, so next let's talk about technical constraints. So oftentimes there's like some technical constraints depending on what you're designing. So sometimes there might be some data management that you need to think about, application infrastructures or device. So what is it that you're developing? Is it a mobile app? Is it a desktop app? What are the constraints? If it is mobile, the constraint would be the screen, the size is a lot smaller. So there's definitely, those are the things that you want to consider. And how to work with technical constraints. So learn and understand the technical constraints the best that you can. Work with the PM, talk to the engineering team, and ask questions. This is very important as a designer. Don't be afraid to ask questions. No matter if you're junior, mid-level, senior, they will like making sure to communicate clearly and understand the needs and the goals is really important. So you might notice a theme here that a lot of the advice is for you to ask questions and to dig deeper. And it is true. And sometimes like you forget about that. Sometimes you learn about the constraints and then you kind of like make assumption and then you're thinking that, oh, maybe this is like it's a requirement and you cannot touch it, right? But like ask questions and learn about it. Like why does this requirement exist? Where is it coming from? And is there a better way to solve the problem than it is currently written in the requirement? Okay, and then the next thing is resource. Again, unless you're just doing something for fun in your spare time, there's often constraints that have to do with the budget. There might be some design resources limitations. So maybe it's a really super huge feature, but you only have like 2 designers working on it. You may not have time to cover everything, all the areas, and there might be development resources constraints. So like maybe it's saying that they need 4 months to build it because they only have like 2 developers to build a really huge feature. So those are some constraints examples. And how do you work with that? So prioritize based on user needs, and then also like think about the product requirements and try to think outside the box. So your first design, maybe it helps solve some of the problems, but if you're learning that, oh, this design doesn't work, like think about, is there an easier way? Maybe, so it's a balance, right? You need to like give and take. So maybe like think going back to the user needs, user goals, the must have versus nice to have, and think through those elements and think about, okay, so maybe this is the must have, maybe this is the nice to have. For the first version, we will make it a little bit easier for the development team because there is development constraints that there's only like 2 developers on the team for a huge feature, and it's just not possible. So think about what is the essential things that is needed. And this is something that like it's not just the designers alone that needs to think about it. It might needs to involve the entire team, needs to involve the engineering team. So make sure that you have this conversation with the team, talk to the product managers, talk to the engineer to understand and brainstorm with them. Sometimes they are the ones with good ideas to think about how to solve the problems that you're trying to solve. Collaborate with others. That's definitely really important. Yeah, so in conclusion, you might notice that there's like a lot of the constraints and how to deal with it is really interrelated. But as a rule of thumb, just like thinking about what's the goal, like what is the purpose of this product, what problem is it trying to solve, and how to solve it, and figuring out there might be 10 different ways to solve the same problem, and then you might want to evaluate and prioritize based on the needs, based on the must-haves versus nice-to-have, based on the time that you have, based on the resource that you have, and all. So with that, it's Q&A time. So I know we're a little bit over, but for whoever wants to stay, I'm happy to stay and answer a few questions if you want to. Or you can raise your hand and turn on your mic if you want to talk. Okay, Celine, do we need to unmute you or can you?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, okay, cool. Of all the constraints you discussed today, which do you find to be the most challenging personally? I mean, like your experience.
Most challenging. I think the time constraint is definitely the one that is like most. I would say they are all challenging in different levels, but time constraint is often the one that is the most. I guess like it will be the most challenging one because like you always have a schedule, you always have like timelines, and also resource. I think the time and resource, I think those are like the big two to consider. And of course, you want to think about the user needs. So I would say like the top 3 is like the user's goals, user needs. Like think through that and think through the time that you have and think through the resource that you have, like with any like technical resource, like maybe there's something that you think it solves the user problem beautifully, but then we just don't have the engineering support, or maybe technically the system does not support what you're thinking. So those are the 3 things that is the most important to solve. Does that answer your question? Cool. All right. Anyone else? Feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. Yeah, just like the hackathon, like time constraints. So if you want to design something really beautiful, but it takes 1 week, but the deadline is tomorrow, then whatever you do doesn't matter after tomorrow. Yeah, anyone else, like maybe current situation, what would you, based on your current situation, again, like figuring out time, and that's a really good question. So you have what, 2 days or 3 days, right? So think about how much time you want to allocate for the task that you need. So first think about the task that you need to do, right? Like, is there like, do you want to still do some research? Maybe not like complete research, but maybe secondary research to at least look at some references and look at some competitive, do some competitive analysis. And so how much time do you need, like out of 3 days? And so I think the deadline is tomorrow, right? You have like about a day and a half. And plus you need to sleep. So you don't actually have a day and a half. You have, I don't know, like maybe 24 hours, assuming that you only sleep for 6 hours-ish. So out of the 24 hours, think about all the tasks that you need to do. Like, what is the goal? What are you trying to build? Is it a website? And what are the requirements? And then based off that, then you might want to say, okay, I want to do like spend 2 hours on research. And then you want to work with your team. If you're in team, then you want to like brainstorm with your team for 2 hours. And so think about setting that milestone. Like think about like having it in like bits and pieces, and to figure out like doing one step at a time. And if you have like a teammate, like think about how to allocate each person's time. So maybe one person can do the research and another person can start drafting some ideas based on the user goals, and then we can like check the ideas against the research and say, okay, it looks like the ideas is meeting some of the needs from the research. If you're able to talk to some participants or users, or like talk to a colleague and say, hey, if we were to build a photo app, what would you like, and to figure it out from there. So oftentimes having like a project manager role, like if there's like 4 of you in a group, if one person can kind of like be that like double as a project manager and help like figure out the tasks and figure out the timeline, that would be helpful. That would make it easier. And then like you want to do like a drop dead timeline, right? So like maybe you want to do a check-in like say 2-3 hours before. So you might want to like do some check-in like every now and then if you're working in a team setting. But then as they get closer, like for that like last 2-3 hours, that rush time, you might want to say, okay, think about the must-have and nice-to-have. Okay, you only have 2 more hours. What can you do in this 2 hours? How can you create, like if you have to present, you also need to set aside time to think through the presentation, think through how you present to the audience. So yeah, so that would be what I suggest. Yeah, and you can like pick some of the ideas from the deck, which will be shared with you to think through how to tackle the problem that you have with the very limited time that you have. Cool. Any more questions? Like, feel free to raise your hand. Don't be shy. All right. I guess last call. I guess if not, then we will close. Vivian, anything else you want to speak to?
No, but just thank you for speaking, and then also thank you everyone else for coming here. And yeah, good luck.
Yeah, well, thank you everyone for joining. Feel free to ping me on LinkedIn or something if you have any further questions. Happy to try to answer it. Very nice speaking with you all, and good luck with everything you're doing with the hackathon. Yeah.